The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
No one would choose authoritarianism over democracy, right? Well, hold that thought, because tonight we'll explore why some young people seem to be trending in just that direction. Then, the compelling case for reviving Indigenous languages across Turtle Island. It's Thursday, October 20th, and that's next on The Agenda. Many people have sought to understand why young people don't turn out to vote in bigger numbers. Here's a scary thought. What if it's because they don't really believe in democracy? New research suggests that might be closer to the truth than most of us would care to admit, and points to a rising interest in authoritarianism among some young people. Here to help us understand what's going on, let's welcome, in London, England, former Deputy Head of Policy at number 10 Downing Street, Will Tanner, who's now Director of the UK think tank Onward. In Oxford, UK, Yasha Monk, Professor at Johns Hopkins University and author of The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. In Montreal, Quebec, Dietlin Stolle, Professor of Political Science at McGill University and former Director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship. And here in our studio, Samantha Rush, Executive Director of the youth-led nonprofit group Apathy is Boring. Okay, great to have everybody on the program today, and I want to start by just sharing some of the numbers that come out of Will Tanner's recent report out of the United Kingdom. More than a quarter of 18 to 34-year-olds in the UK think democracy is a bad way of governing the country. That is 3 times higher than the share of those over age 55. 61% agree that, quote, having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament and elections would be a good way of governing this country. That number's doubled since 1999. 46% agree that, quote, having the army rule would be a good way of governing the country. That's a 5-fold increase since 1999. Here's Canadian youth views on democracy from those age 18 to 29. Only 39% in that age category strongly agree with the statement, democracy may have its problems, but it's better than any other form of government. That compares to 74% of those 60 and over. 49%, half of young people surveyed, are neutral on the question. 21% of young Canadians agree that it doesn't matter whether a government is democratic or non-democratic. 12% agree that under some circumstances, an authoritarian government may be preferable to a democratic one. That is twice the proportion of those over age 60 who would say this. And I guess we should note, in Canada, these numbers have remained relatively stable over the past few years when compared to other countries. That may suggest less of a trend towards more anti-democratic views among youth. One more graphic here. In the United States, their views on democracy among youth, age 18 to 29. 52%, roughly half of young Americans consider their democracy to be in trouble or failing. 13% of them don't know whether it's important that America is a democracy. 7% say either not very or not important at all. Those are the gory details. Yasha, you first. How worried are you about all this?
Well, I'm very concerned. My colleague Roberto Fora and I looked at very similar data 7 or 8 years ago to make the case that democracy in countries like the United States could come to be in trouble. This was at a time when people assumed that it was kind of strange and kooky to talk about potential threats to American democracy. What I learned in graduate school was that democratic institutions in rich countries that had had democratic elections for a very long time were completely certain. And it turned out to be a very good lead indicator, because a couple of years later, we got the election of Donald Trump, his attacks on the democratic system, and ultimately the assault on the Capitol on the 6th of January 2021. So what we're seeing here is asking some of those same questions again 5 or 6 years later. Things have actually gotten worse than they were at that point. And I think that just shows us the extent to which young people believe that the system is not delivering for them, are skeptical about the extent to which things are working for them and the system is going to deliver for them in the future. And that is as bright a warning sign as it was when we looked at that data originally a number of years ago.
Will Tanner, what do the numbers say to you?
Well, I too am deeply concerned. And I think what's interesting about this data and this report in particular is the extent to which, whereas previously we thought that the threat to democracy might be geographic in the sense that it was particular parts of the country. You might think of the Rust Belt in America. You might think of the Red Wall in the UK, where voters are particularly disenfranchised or feel disenchanted with the status quo in terms of the government of the country. We saw that with Brexit. We saw that to some degree with Donald Trump. Actually, this data suggests that the problem may be generational, that there is a number of age cohorts, particularly the 18 to 35-year-old cohort, who have grown up in a period where actually democracy was not under threat internationally. There was not a kind of big battle for democracy versus other forms of government around the world, and authoritarianism in particular, where democracy perhaps hasn't delivered for them, as Yasha says, and they have actually not really been sold on the benefits of democracy. And I think the long run effects of that in terms of the health of our democracies in the long term is profoundly worrying, actually. It could lead to a return for authoritarian forms of government. And I would say that that could happen on the left or the right. I'm not sure this is specifically a right-wing versus left-wing threat. I think it could happen across the political spectrum.
Professor Stoller, let me put the accent on Canada as I bring you into the conversation. We like to think in Canada that we are enjoying one of the saner democracies in this world. And I wonder whether you think we are somehow able to avoid much of the numbers that we have presented so far.
I thought so too. In fact, I was kind of skeptical when Yasha came out with his report a few years ago. No offense, Yasha. And we thought that young people really participate, for example, very differently in politics. And a lot of measures don't capture that. So we need to look at this very differently. So we also thought that maybe when we also measure the support for democracy, we cannot ask the normal survey questions about an abstract concept. And so we actually established some survey questions that dig more into what really makes democracy work. So, for example, we ask whether it's okay if a political leader takes away the checks from the executive, for example, in terms of media control or parliamentary contributions and judiciary limitations. And we thought that young people would not agree with this. We also thought that young people would not agree with some freedoms that can be removed. And what we found in our research, including in experiments, is that young people in particular are more laissez-faire about these issues and don't care as much when undemocratic politicians act. And that is worrisome to us. And it also happens in Canada as well as in the US. And we also see a similar trend in European countries.
Sam, I have purposely left you for the end so that you could hear what everybody else had to say first. And also because I presume you're in the age demographic that we are talking about here. And I want you to tell somebody who's of my generation why I ought not to be utterly mortified at these numbers.
I mean, I think we should all be utterly mortified by these numbers. I don't think that that's something that young people or different generational cohorts, should feel differently about. I think what we're seeing here is, one, I think youth can be a leading indicator in a lot of ways. When you have young people who are very concerned about their financial futures, very concerned by the idea that their government isn't working for them. And we have known that they felt that way for a long time. The research that we do into barriers to why people don't vote or participate in elections, for example, young people have been saying for years, I don't like politicians, they don't speak for me, they don't speak to me, and they're all the same, and it doesn't make a difference whether I vote or not.
Older people think that too.
Yes.
But they don't question democracy as a result of it. They question the politicians in question.
I think that the outcomes of that over time have built these narratives around, especially when you add into the mix really urgent problems that we're facing that are time-bound. So climate change, for example. Young people feel very strongly that we need to act urgently and now. And we even have international bodies saying now that the governments of Western democracies are like sleepwalking towards climate disaster. And the stress of that young people feel. I think they're looking for decisive action on these issues, and I don't think they feel their governments are responding quickly enough in the way that they would like them to.
Yasha Monk, you're around young people all the time, given your perch at Johns Hopkins. Do you think young people don't understand what democracy actually is?
No, I think they understand the basics of the democratic system. At least my students do. I make sure of that. I do think, though, that part of this is something that Steve, you and I, as people who are in the media, should be somewhat self-critical about, because I think sometimes we are capable of focusing so much on the negative aspects of our society, so much on the things that aren't working, though we forget about some of the things that are working. Now, look, it's natural to be angry about the injustices in our society. It's natural to be angry about living standards not going up. It's natural to focus on those negative aspects. But I think when the narrative so exclusively comes to focus on those downsides, and we're not capable of actually expressing in a clear way what the values of our political system are, why it is so important to have a political system that has both collective self-determination and individual freedom, and how much better people have it in Britain, in Canada, in the United States, than in so many countries in the world that are led by authoritarian leaders who are not any better, by the way, at dealing with challenges like climate change, but who are much better at repressing their populations, at jailing people for what they're saying, at starting wars like we've seen Russia do in Ukraine recently. Then we shouldn't be surprised that people don't realize the upsides of their system. And what I find in general is that when you have democratic institutions, it's easy to start taking them for granted. You don't credit them for any of the good things they do, but you blame them for all of the bad things in your society. Once you start losing them, or when you don't have them, as we see the brave young people, men and many women in Iran standing up for these rights at the moment, then you really want those back. But of course, at that time, it is incredibly difficult to win those freedoms. So I'm optimistic about people fighting for freedom and for democracy in the long run, but I hope that they start doing that before it becomes far too hard.
Well, let me just ask Will the direct question. Do you think democracy has served, let's say you're 30 years old, has democracy well served 30-year-olds and younger over the past 3 decades?
No, I don't think so. And I think, especially in the country that I'm in, the UK, we have had a political system that has served older generations much better than younger generations. If you're in your 20s or 30s here in the UK, you are unlikely to be able to afford to buy a home in the same way that previous generations would have expected to. You are likely to be delaying the point at which you start a family because of financial costs. You're likely to be burdened, if you've been to university, you're burdened with a marginal tax rate, if you're a higher rate taxpayer, of 51%, higher than even people on £150,000 a year. So young people, I think, today rightly feel pretty peeved about the democratic system and the extent to which it's served them. And I do worry that increasingly young people are turning to more anti-democratic means in order to get their voice heard. So in the UK, for example, only a few weeks ago, we had a number of young people glue themselves to the Speaker's chair in the House of Commons in order to protest around climate change. Now, that's a very worthy cause, but that act is the very definition of an anti-democratic act. They were quite literally saying, Parliament is not serving us. We need, in this case, a People's Assembly instead. So the natural consequence of some of this disenchantment, I think, is a movement away from our democratic institutions. And I think politicians of all sides have, unfortunately, participated in a trashing of our institutions in this country, whether that's the rule of law, whether that's things like the Office for Budget Responsibility and fiscal discipline in this country, and that has moved young people away from democracy and opened the door to more authoritarian or anti-democratic forms of participation.
But Dietland, here's the part of the equation that I don't understand, which is your students, all of your students, they spend their formative teenage years essentially trying to defy authority, namely their parents. And yet we hear now in these surveys that if democracy is not working for them, they're prepared to take a step towards authoritarianism, which you'd think would be the exact opposite of what they'd want to do because they've been chafing against it for all of their life so far. Can you explain how that makes any sense?
Yeah, first of all, I think we should also maybe make a distinction. We cannot just talk about all young people. I mean, I think for some people the system has worked, but students and their education has, of course, helped them to see some advantages of the democratic system. But I think what happens is that when young people don't see their goals and their political goals, climate change or immigration or whatever the issue is from all political sides, don't see it addressed and don't see their own worries addressed in the political system, don't see a political party that reaches out to them. That's when a leader that potentially is unifying, that is also overcoming the divisions in our society, the polarization in our society, and that maybe is a unifying symbol and that is forging ahead with some interesting ideas that they subscribe to. I think that leader then sounds attractive. And that doesn't necessarily mean that these young people take all of the disadvantages of an authoritarian society as well, or that they want to support that as well. But the idea of a strong leader that can overcome these divisions, that's, I think, what's interesting to young people.
Well, okay, Sam, walk us through this, because I've heard you talk about something called the survival instinct way of thinking, which you think young people are engaged in, and therefore leads them towards flirting with authoritarianism. What is that?
So I think similar to what Will said, which I think is a really important point, I think it's the case in the UK that a lot of young people, for example, can't afford a home, but it's the case in Canada here too, and has been for a while, especially in our major cities. And so you have people's basic needs in a sense. They have expectations about sort of the milestones of their lives and how that's going to go, and then the world sort of changes, the context changes, and those expectations aren't met. So there's a degree of stress of, am I going to be able to afford to have children? I hear young people talk about this all the time. Can I afford a kid? What about clean air and water and all of these things? And so this climate anxiety is a thing that people are talking about now. So there's this mental health burden to a lot of these things. And I agree that it impacts different youth to different degrees. But what happens when you have this stress or you have, mental health anxiety rates rising, depression, is that people resort to sort of this black or white thinking, which is a very simplified way of looking at the world. So you have this stress, someone comes along and offers you a solution, as Ditlin was saying, a solution that's simple, ignores a lot of the complexity in the world and tells you, I will fix this thing. And in that moment, there are people who will choose to just say, yes, okay, do it.
But that's the thing, Will. I mean, do people, okay, they've got grievances with the current democratic system. I get that. Everybody understands that. But to take the next leap and say, therefore, we're going to cozy up to authoritarianism. I mean, do they not look around the world nowadays? Do they not see what's happening in authoritarian countries? Therefore, I'm having trouble understanding the allure of it all. Maybe you can help me with that.
Well, I think the important thing to note is that in the UK, at least, we have not seen young people actively joining authoritarian parties, and we haven't seen a kind of big surge in authoritarianism amongst young people within the political process. But you are starting to see that within some European countries. If you look at what happened in the recent French election, I think 49% of 25 to 34-year-olds voted for Marine Le Pen, for example. You saw that in the recent Italian election, in the recent Swedish election as well. And Yasha's done a huge amount of work specifically on that trend towards authoritarianism within Europe. So he's the expert there. But I think actually, I would say first past the post contested democracies like the UK and the US, you see that much less because there's less ability for authoritarian parties to break through and kind of appeal to those grievances, particularly of young people. But that's not to say it can't happen in the future. And I think what we were trying to do with this report is sound a bit of a warning sign, sound just not to the left in this country who does win the votes of young people, but also to the right, to the Conservatives who are in power, who don't typically think about young people, particularly within the policy-making process, but really need to if they're going to avoid democracy falling into trouble in the future. And I think that's a key question. This isn't just a question for kind of progressive parties who do appeal to young people at the moment. It's also a problem for centre-right parties who believe in democracy as the best way to run a government.
Yasha, I wonder how much of this as well is rooted in the fact that when I was the age of the people we're talking about tonight, the Cold War was on, and it was pretty obvious what side you wanted to be on, and you knew you didn't want to be on the other side. We're at actually just past the 50th anniversary of the Summit Series, the Canada-Soviet hockey series that was the most incredible hockey series of all time. And you know, if you lived through that, you knew what side you wanted to be on. Do you think part of the problem today is that young people don't know history? They don't know current affairs. Is that an issue?
Yeah, and again, I think when I look at how civics is taught in many countries, there is an emphasis on the downsides of our political system, on the injustices of today. There's often an emphasis on how we can go and become politically active. And both of those things are very good. That should be a part of the civic education of our citizens or of our future citizens. But what we often don't do is to say, here are the upsides of liberal democracy. Here is the huge downsides of authoritarian systems. Here's what it looked like to live under communist regimes. Here's what it looked like to live under fascist regimes. Here's what it's like to live today in Venezuela or Russia or other places. But I want to pick up on one strand of a conversation. I think Will started to talk about this a little bit, but there's a kind of tacit assumption that perhaps all of us had in parts of a conversation that, you know, young people are much more progressive and liberal, right? That the reason why young people are frustrated is that they want really radical action on climate change and we're just not delivering enough on that and so on. And I just want to be a little bit cautious about that. So I'm looking here, for example, at a recent Gallup poll in the United States, which shows that among 18 to 29-year-olds, 34% of young people consider themselves liberal, so left-leaning, 41% consider themselves moderate, and 23% consider themselves conservative. So it's only about a third of young people who would actually consider themselves left-leaning according to this poll. And so there's sort of different reasons why different young people are going to be dissatisfied with democracy. There's going to be some left-leaning ones who say we want more radical action on climate change, we don't like people like Donald Trump being elected in office, etc. There's also going to be conservative young people who feel very differently about what's going on in the society, which helps to explain, as Will was saying, that a lot of young people voted for Marine Le Pen in France in the last elections. And there's a lot of people in the center of politics who probably just think, you know, there's so much rancor and so much polarization and so much hatred. I don't think the system is working for me, but not necessarily because they feel that, politics is either too far to the left or too far to the right for them, but simply because they have a sense there's too much fighting, too much rancor, and not enough delivering on actual issues.
Well, Sam, I'm clearly not asking this about you because you are engaged in the issues of the day. You're, apathy is boring is your organization. You're all about trying to get young people to engage more with the democratic institutions of the country. From what I see, when young people want to get involved in public life, for example, it's easy. They volunteer, they're in on the ground floor, they could end up being the chief of staff to a politician a year later. I mean, sometimes it's that easy. What do you see that maybe I'm not about how impenetrable some of our democratic institutions may be if young people want to engage with them? Is that an issue?
Definitely. And I think I just want to touch on something that was brought up before. I think one of the things with democracy that we don't tend to separate enough is democracy in and of itself is an idea about how our society is governed, but how that's operationalized is our political system. Those are the rules, right, that we all follow, and the norms and the practices and all of that. So I think when we think about how civics is taught, for example, in schools, we often focus on these very rigid procedural elements. You know, a bill goes to the House of Commons and then it gets passed in the first reading and blah, blah, blah. And yes, that's important to know. But what we don't always talk about is sort of the norms and practices that surround that. And so it can be very intimidating to walk into a political environment if you don't understand who's really holding the levers of power, where those discussions happen. And in Canada particularly, I think a lot of our political debate is relegated into caucus environments that are closed. So we don't always see the open debate. We see question period where people might be throwing, barbs back and forth at each other, but not the same rigor, I guess.
I hear you, but do they understand that anybody can join a political party in this country, and most parties don't charge anything for doing it? You can go to conventions, you can get in on the ground floor, you can participate, you can have an impact. They don't see that?
I think they know that it's possible. I don't think they know why they would want to do it. And I think that's the interesting part. How does power get allocated in those environments? Are you taken seriously? Are you able to have a say? I think young people will put their energy because they care so deeply about issues, and I think Yasha's right, those issues are varied and there's no monolith among youth. But I really think that it's important that we remember that young people will show up and put their energy where they feel their energy is making a difference. And if they don't feel that way, then they won't. And that's why voter turnout goes up and down when it comes to young people and has been trending down for so long. I think they don't see the purpose of it. So they'll find other channels and other ways, and that's what we're talking about here today, to see their priorities addressed. And if the political system that we have currently is not addressing those issues, then they will look to other places. They will, glue themselves to the speaker's chair, or that's an expression of frustration around their ability to have an impact in our political system when we say that democracy is there to represent all of us, and some are better represented than others.
Deedlin, can I ask you about your students? I mean, you're teaching poli-sci students, so we have to assume off the top that they're interested in these kinds of issues. Do they feel that the political institutions of this country are so impenetrable right now that there's no point in engaging?
Yes, I would agree with what has been said before, that there is a doubt that political institutions will actually react to them. And there is even research showing and confirming this. So when political parties, for example, reach out and experiments explicitly make a stance for young people, they are being punished by other voters. So it is politically risky even parties to reach out to young people. There needs to be a political solution that is much more universal and that kind of cuts across party politics as we see it right now in order to address this fundamental problem. But because of that, as Samantha said, there is a reaction of young people. They don't expect political actors to react to them, so they kind of withdraw into a different world. And what we see now is also that the young people don't know all the details about living in an authoritarian society, but they also don't know all the aspects of what makes a democracy work. And so, for example, when we ask democratic knowledge questions, not procedural ones, but just kind of, what is this situation democratic or not? How do you feel about it? Younger people are much less likely to judge or evaluate the situation correctly as either democratic or undemocratic. So the lack of democratic knowledge even is also very blatant. And so we see even kind of an interesting conundrum that people, for example, who think that democracy is important also support a very strong leader who can do away with elections and so on.
Yasha, is it worse in America because the country is so much more polarized than we are in Canada?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in Canada, you have a political system that Canadians like to complain about for good reason. Everybody complains about their own political system. But I do think that there is a sense that, there are 2 or 3 sane choices at each election, that elections have consequences. Sometimes there's a change of government, and then that new government can actually pursue different policies. And then at the next election, voters get a chance to say, hey, did the government do a good job, or did I actually not like it very much, and perhaps I'll go back to voting for the other set of parties that are currently in opposition. In the United States, there is both a sense that the polarization is extreme, that often very motivated activist bases control the political parties, so that many people feel that they don't particularly like either political party. And then when a party does win a presidential election, for example, there are so many veto powers, so many roadblocks to actually passing reform and legislation that it doesn't seem to have very much impact on the kind of policies that the government pursues and the kind of laws that are on the book. And so that mixture between stasis and anger, that mixture between nothing really changes, nothing really happens, but people are shouting all of the time, and these people I really dislike on the television every day, and they're in power, that's a really unhealthy mix, and I think it does create a deeper cynicism about democracy among young people in the United States, but also among older people in the United States.
Well, okay, but Will, how much of this is just out-and-out complacency? They assume democracy's been here yesterday, it's here today, it'll be here tomorrow, and they don't feel they really need to engage or participate in order to ensure its continuation.
I think the interesting question is the extent to which this is actually cultural and part of a much broader trend amongst young people. So in our study that you cited, Steve, we looked at trends of things like volunteering and civic participation amongst young people, and we know that across many generations or many years, young people have become less and less likely to do those things. And if you look back through the history of democracy, people like de Tocqueville and others called civic participation, civic association, the mother science of democracy. That was the thing that kept it working. People participating in broader civic society. They might be a member of a trade union. They might be a member of a friendly society back in the day. And a lot of that kind of infrastructure and association has fallen away. And young people today are increasingly isolated. They're much less likely to have close friends. They're much less likely to participate in some of those groups. They're much less likely to volunteer in their community. And I do think that that has quite a profound impact on democracy. That kind of undermines some of that cultural support for collective bargaining, as Yasha was talking about earlier. And so I'm not sure it is complacency. I think it's a broader cultural shift. And the interesting thing about that is if that is true, then those things are possible to reverse. It is possible to find new ways to engage young people in volunteering and civic participation. It is possible to introduce new forms of civic service on a national scale, as you have in some countries. And so I do think that there is an interesting policy question, but I'm not sure it's complacency. I think it's a broader cultural shift.
Well, you've nicely led us to where we need to go next, which is, okay, if we want to get more young people engaged and get them turned on to democracy, Dietland, let's have some ideas. What do we need to do?
Well, I think one idea would be to have more direct contacts to people who live in authoritarian societies and to have them tell our young people what kind of the limitations and constraints are and what kind of sacrifices people make living in such societies, and therefore exchange about the potential values of a democratic system. I think that was, for example, a missed opportunity in a united Germany back then, when we could have had more direct exchanges of people living in the East coming to the West and the other way around to tell each other about each other's societies. That was not done. There was a focus on very fast unification, for example. So that was a missed opportunity. And I think today that we don't have the kind of divisions of the Cold War where we get more direct information about the other side of the wall, so to say. We need this kind of input of these societies. So that could be arranged in civics lessons in schools and organizations and so on. I mean, that would be one idea. The other would be to make civic lessons much more interesting and hands-on, to actually have young people be responsible for a certain part of a city's budget, for example, and to be able to decide together what to do with this budget according to their wishes, so they can follow through with their democratic ideas and their conversations, their dialogue with the other side, and so on. So to have a hands-on civics lessons is much more important than the actual procedural aspects of a democracy that you learn more theoretically.
I love these ideas. Let's keep going. Sam, what else?
I mean, I think there's a lot of work to be done at the local level. I know we've all seen sort of the stats around the voter turnout in the municipal elections that just happened in BC, and obviously there are municipal elections happening on Monday here in Ontario. And I think that there's a big loss that's happening at that level, where one, we don't seem to have the same kind of media coverage locally, especially in smaller communities. So people don't really know what's happening in their city halls. But there's so much work that can be done at that level to build trust. Young people tend to trust municipal governments better, more so than other levels of government. And there's work that can be done there, to the point around volunteering, creating local networks where people can have dialogue around things happening in their community, discuss solutions, and then building power at that level, I think is one way that's appealing to young people, particularly around issues that they do care about, and also can allow them to have a bit more of that feedback loop around actually making an impact, because it's so much easier to sort of set up around these nested goals and incrementally work towards change, change than expecting to go from 0 to eradicating climate change, for example. And really doing that experiential learning and community learning and mentorship, I think, from what we've seen in our programs, gives people so much more confidence in their ability to have an impact at all, but also gives a sense of belonging and breaks down some of the social isolation that we haven't even really touched on, but is impacting so many young people, particularly after the pandemic, where we do see this loss of connection with the people who live around us. And that lack of sense of belonging is also leading people into spaces where they do find that belonging. But the narratives that come along with that, the worldviews that come along with that, and in some cases, the shared outright lies about our broader society that come with that is the trade-off that we're seeing for some young people.
Yasha Monk, what else?
Well, I think we have a lot of great ideas on the table. I think Sam is absolutely right about the need for concrete ways to get engaged locally. I think Will is right about the need for a form of national service where people can choose to spend a year or 6 months or perhaps 2 years really engaging in communities. I think Rosalind made important points about the need for more and better civics lessons and for us to really communicate what it's like to live in authoritarian systems. By the way, one of the things I've been struck by is how little coverage there's been in Western media of these incredibly courageous protests in Iran. I don't understand why this incredible, inspiring, important story is hardly being talked about. That is important in itself, and it also would be an important moment for people to learn about that. But I want to say something slightly paradoxical, which is that I fear that when politicians and institutions and so on say, hey, we worry about how unengaged young people are, we should give them more of a voice, we should listen to them more, what we often do is a mistake, which is they then assume that those young people who are really engaged in a political process, who are really activists, speak for the rest of their generation. But nearly by definition, that is not the case, because they're actually part of the minority of young people who are super engaged in the political system, and often their views are systematically different from others. So paradoxically, we need to create more space for young people to engage in the political system, but we should also be aware of thinking, hey, those people who are engaging, who are really activists, are actually representative of public opinion among young people more broadly.
Okay, we got a minute and change to go here. Will, I want to give it to you. Because, well, look, as you get older, you kind of turn on to some ideas that when you were a kid, you might have thought were a bit crazy. You start to like jazz. You start to like classical music. Is it possible that as these 18 to 30-year-olds get older, they'll just kind of turn on to democracy by virtue of getting older?
So it is possible, but what we know from all of the data is that they are becoming more democratic more slowly, perhaps, than other generations before them, and that if you look at different points in time, younger generations are significantly more likely to be anti-democratic than previous generations at the age at which they are. So this does seem to be a cohort effect rather than an age effect, to use the technical terminology, i.e. these cohorts are structurally more likely to be anti-democratic, and that is unlikely to change dramatically as they age. But just in terms of what we can do about it, just very quickly, I very strongly agree with Yasha around the idea of national civic service. But just to pick up on one thing that Sam said, I think local journalism is crucial here, and much better journalism to reach young people. And I think that's one of the biggest shifts that we've seen over the last few decades as social media and kind of internet journalism has taken hold. That kind of authoritative local journalism and that local democratic voice has been lost. And I think that is one of the biggest problems in many Western democracies, and it's common across all of these countries that we've talked about tonight.
Some wonderful, wonderful ideas here. I want to thank the four of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your views. Will Tanner, Yasha Monk, Declan Stoll, Samantha Roosh. Thanks, everybody, very much. Language debates in Canada often center around English and French. But long before those were the official languages of Canada, Indigenous languages thrived here. With us now on what happened to those languages, and particularly on efforts to revive some that have nearly been lost, we're joined by Ryan Decaire. He is Associate Professor at the University of Toronto's Centre for Indigenous Studies and Department of Linguistics, and a Mohawk language teacher. Ryan, it's good to see you again.
Pleasure.
You and I first met, it's got to be more than 10 years ago. You were a university student.
That's right.
And you spoke some Mohawk for us.
That's right, yeah.
Would you introduce yourself in the Mohawk language?
Sure. What gon hurado ze wagwego. Ryan yujat swahta ni the wagen, waganya gehaga na jatoda, the new ways ze gon iges.
Did you just say what I just said? But
Close enough. I said welcome. It's great to be here, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Yeah. Take us back more than a century ago. There were efforts in this country made to suppress Indigenous languages from being spoken.
That's right.
How successful were those efforts?
They were quite successful, but like that, when we think about how negative it was, there's also positives right at the beginning. When you look at the first superintendent of Indigenous Affairs, he spoke Mohawk language quite proficiently. And from there, it developed a good relationship with Indigenous people. But then we noticed suppression that aligned with taking over land bases and trying to acquire resources to really fuel development in the New World and also back in Europe.
So tell us how it worked. How did they try to suppress Indigenous languages a century ago?
Well, at first taking away lands, or pushing Indigenous people off onto reserves, and then up until more recently, the residential school system, which quite a few people are now quite familiar with, especially since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. So you can go from, say, pushing people away off their lands. We even call the President of the United States in Mohawk Ranadagarias, and that means a town destroyer, because he created a military campaign to push our people away from our villages and lay waste to them and set them on fire and burn our corn.
Was this Andrew Jackson, or which president was that?
No, that was the first president of the United States, yeah.
George Washington.
Yeah, George Washington, yeah. And that called that the Sullivan Campaign. So you can go all the way back to then also to more recently in the 1900s, which is residential schools, and then 60s scoop. And residential schools especially were quite devastating in the early 1900s, probably 1920s to 1950s, where that would be people of my grandparent generation. They were sent there quite forcibly to only speak English. And it wasn't just about taking kids away from their communities to only speak English. They humiliated them. Right? They punished them. They would put pins in their tongues whenever they spoke their language, to the point where it created this attitude around Indigenous languages in Indigenous communities that they were inferior, that they were wrong, that they were bad.
Well, we have some stats on this that we want to share with our viewers and listeners right now. This is from Stats Canada. Today, there are more than 70 Indigenous languages spoken in more than 600 First Nations, 50 Inuit communities, and a variety of Métis groups. The most common are Cree and Inuktitut. In Ontario, it's Ojibwe. A number of these languages have fewer than 1,000 speakers, and one has only 210 speakers.
That's right.
Only 210 people who know this language anymore. Yep. The number of people identifying as Indigenous has grown almost twice as fast as the non-Indigenous population in Canada. It's now 1.8 million, or 5% of the population, and yet, in the last 5 years, the number of Indigenous people who could hold a conversation in an Indigenous language, despite that population growth, the number has actually dropped by 4.3%. The number of Indigenous people who could speak an Indigenous language that wasn't their mother tongue grew by 7%, so there are more people learning these languages as a second language. However, there was also an 8% drop in the number of Indigenous people whose first language learned during childhood was Indigenous.
That's right.
So that's the lay of the land right now. There is a massive generation gap in knowledge when it comes to Indigenous languages. What does that look like on the ground?
Well, you're right. The best languages for vitality are Inuktitut and Cree, and some of those languages, such as Inuktitut, 80% of people can speak it. But then most other Indigenous languages, largely, almost all of them, yes, maybe 2%. If you're lucky for some, 2%. And then that 2%, the people who can speak it to a high level are 60 and older, right? So what you have is this parent generation of people who cannot speak it and they can't pass it on to their children. And that's where you really notice an increase in language vitality, is when there's intergenerational transmission from parents down to children.
Did your parents speak it?
No.
So how do you know it so well?
Because I had to take the time to be around first language speakers to actually acquire the language to a high enough proficiency to speak it as a primary language. And that took me over 3,000 hours of work.
And why did you want to do that?
Because it's the language of my people where I grew up, right? It's because I know that language is distinct and it brings me happiness. And I know that it's going to bring my community happiness to be connected with who they are, their history, and their future.
You say it took 3,000 hours to learn that, and I want to pick up on that because and I don't know if these comparisons make any sense, so you'll forgive me here if this is off base, but you know, if you're English, it's not a long journey necessarily to learn French or Italian or Spanish. They're all Romance languages. They have some things in common. Same with, you know, Hebrew and Arabic. They have a lot of things in common.
That's right.
What about indigenous languages? Do they have anything in common with other languages that would therefore, where you could say, I know how to speak X language, therefore learning Mohawk is not that tough?
It's very similar to the European situation, where we have language families in Canada and the United States, where there exist a number of languages within that family that are related, right? So if you know one of them, your ability to learn the next one is going to be a lot easier. However, if your first language is English, which is the primary language of most Indigenous people in Canada, to learn an Indigenous language is way harder to learn an Indigenous language than, say, learning French, right, or Spanish, because it's of a completely different language family. The structure is totally different. So if, say, I, as a first language English speaker, want to become a French language speaker, there is research now put out that has determined that it takes around 700 hours to become a proficient, highly proficient French speaker or Spanish speaker if your first language is English. However, if you want to become a highly proficient speaker of Mohawk or Ojibwe or Inuktitut, it requires at least 3,000 hours.
So more than 4 times as much.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay, look at that big board there.
Yeah.
It's the same alphabet, right? Same alphabet?
Yeah, it's based on the Roman alphabet.
Pretty much the same alphabet?
Very similar.
Okay, so it's not like then trying to learn Hebrew or Arabic, which is a completely different language.
That's right.
And it's left to right, unlike Hebrew, which is right to left.
Yep.
So we have that much in common.
That's definitely a benefit.
So where's the trick? Why is it 4 times harder to learn Mohawk than it would be to learn French?
Well, because when you look at the different structural properties, say, of English versus Mohawk, Mohawk is what is designated as a polysynthetic language, which means that it's comprised of many different morphemes that you have to learn how to attach all these morphemes to create one word.
Morpheme?
Morpheme is like one part of a word, right? One part of a word. And then when you put those all together, it forms a sentence. So when you look at English, there's unlimited sentences in English. In Mohawk, one word is a sentence. So that means there's unlimited words in Mohawk, and you have to learn how to put all these little pieces together to create one word. And that's what really signifies it as being a different way to think about this world. And then, even though the orthography, how it's written, might be similar, what the number one barrier isn't really the structural properties, it's access to its use, right? Curriculum, hearing people, being around the language, having the ability to go speak it with people, and that's really the number one challenge.
I have certainly spoken to Indigenous people about this in the past, about the issue of 2 official languages in Canada, English and French.
Yep.
Where do Indigenous people see themselves in that narrative?
Well, Indigenous people existed here long before French and English languages arrived here. So I don't understand why anybody wouldn't see how it would be important for them to also be official.
There is a certain offense taken that the notion that we have 2 official languages in the country.
That's definitely true, especially for people who feel that we should play a strong role in the Canadian politic. Although there are people that really feel that we shouldn't get caught up in that issue between French and English, because we often get tossed in between this debate over French and English use, and we'd rather be focusing more on how do we create a primary speaking community within our own communities. Yeah.
Do you have some empathy or simpatico with French-speaking people in the country who see their language as being under threat and who, as we've seen in the province of Quebec, have taken some extraordinary measures, some people think illegal measures, in order to protect the French language? Do you have some simpatico for that?
100%. And I think most Indigenous people do. Because when you look at the French situation, they are a minority language relative to English, and English is the dominating language. And if you do not set up structures to try and thwart any kind of further decline of its use, when English is so powerful, you are going to see its demise over time. But when you compare that with the Indigenous language situation, we understand it far more strongly in the sense that French has never been endangered in Quebec. It's never been even close to endangered.
They would disagree, but anyway. I mean,
yes, depending on you define endangered.
Endangered, right.
And endangered meaning that it's likely not to be passed on to a new generation, and that only grandparents are speaking it today, which is not even anywhere close. Not to mention that you can go across the great waters to France, where millions of people continue to speak it. We don't have that. This is our home. This is where it always has existed. So that's where the animosity or the challenge comes when you're trying to protect French language, but in so doing, you're also marginalizing Indigenous languages that have existed here far longer than French and English.
Mary Simon, of course, first Indigenous Governor General in Canadian
right.
history. She can speak English.
Yes.
She can speak Inuktitut.
That's right.
She can't speak French, one of the so-called official languages of the country. When she was appointed, there were apparently more than 1,000 complaints received by the federal government because of her inability to speak French.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Well, wouldn't it be, like, when you think about that, wouldn't it be nice if those letters were sent to congratulate her for being able to speak an Indigenous language? I wonder if there's any letters. I imagine there's not. And how amazing that would be for people to celebrate her, that she can do that, and to really show it that that's a part of what it is to be here in these lands that we call Canada, and to question themselves and ask, why don't I speak an Indigenous language too? What's the history behind that? And instead of putting us in between English and French and saying, oh, she, maybe that she wouldn't be there if she only spoke French in an Indigenous language. That's what some people are saying.
Yeah.
And instead of concentrating on that, why don't we concentrate on what can we do to support Indigenous languages to ensure that they're going to be have strong vitality in the future?
Okay, I'm now going to do the very thing you've just accused me of people of doing, which is, can you appreciate how unhappy Francophones must be that the Governor General of the country can't speak one of the country's, again, so-called official languages?
Sure. Yeah, I could appreciate that. At the same time, I would also like for them to have a stronger understanding of support of the situation of Indigenous languages.
Understood. If you are a public servant working for the federal government of this country, and you can speak French and English fluently, it's a real asset for you. In fact, it's a financial asset for you, because they'll give you $800 a year as a bonus if you can speak both official languages. If you can speak English and Inuktitut, or French and Ojibwe, there's no bonus.
Not
what do you think of that?
It's not surprising. One, that's not enshrined in any law for an Indigenous language to get a bonus. This is something that the Indigenous Languages Act should promote, to put Indigenous languages on equal footing with English and French. However, even if we did get that, that assumes that, one, Indigenous people want to work for the federal government. A large majority likely don't want to. They want to work in their own communities to promote their own language. Two, it's somewhat of a distraction in the sense that that kind of money isn't really going to support Indigenous languages where they need to be supported for revitalization to truly occur. And if you look, say, for example, to our nearest neighbors in the United States with an Indigenous language that has been successful at revitalization is the Hawaiian language. So what do they do to support the Hawaiian language? Teachers who become proficient speakers of Hawaiian and become teachers of Hawaiian, they get an $8,000 bonus every year. So compare 8,000 to 800. And why is that? It's because they notice that Hawaiian is struggling and that they need the extra added support to ensure that they're going to be creating speakers in the future.
So there's some real incentive there.
Oh, and there needs to be. Right.
Okay, so put it in the Canadian context. What should we do to ensure that Indigenous languages not just survive, but thrive in the future?
Well, there's two things we need to consider. We need to consider top-down strategies and bottom-up strategies, and a multi-pronged strategy. At first, we do need to guarantee the rights of Indigenous people to have full education in their languages, which is not guaranteed under Official Languages Act or the Indigenous Languages Act, to have somewhat equal rights as do French and do English.
So you want a law that says that?
Yes,
okay.
And to garner the same financial resources to actually make that happen. That includes teacher training, actually training people to become highly proficient speakers of those languages, and all the infrastructure that goes with it. So there's that. However, the most important thing is to ensure that all that money, all that financial resources go to the best practices for creating speakers of our languages.
How much money goes to that right now?
I can't give you an accurate number, but far less than goes into implementing official languages policy. That's for darn sure.
Yeah, for sure.
And if we really look at what are the best practices, what we're seeing now is because there's been a big cut between the intergenerational transmission of our languages, the parent generation, young adults, need to become highly proficient in order to teach to their children. So we're seeing that what we're calling adult immersion programs, which is putting adults in a full immersion program for 2 to 3 years, with it's their only responsibility to learn the language, so they can learn the language to a high enough level to recreate a peer group of use within their community, so then they can then pass it on to their new children. And that's what we're seeing today. We're seeing second language learners who become highly proficient, who are now recreating first language speaking children within the home. And that's one indicator that the language is doing well or coming back to life, is when you see it going back to the children.
Is that a top-down solution or a bottom-up solution?
That's definitely a mix of it, but it's more bottom-up, because it's really the grassroots people who are working hard to make that happen. Yeah. But they can't do it without top-down support from the government, which we don't have.
How many people in your typical daily life,
Sure.
How many people can you talk Mohawk to?
I can talk, oh, you mean on just an average day?
Yeah.
Well, what you have to do when you speak these languages is you have to set up your life around being around other people who speak the language. So you have to be around everybody who does, so you structure your life around that. Some people will call that a sacrifice. I wouldn't, because it's a delight to be around those people. But today, Mohawk, there's probably around between 600 and 1,000 people who speak it, probably closer to 600.
In the province or country or what?
In the world.
In
That's
the
it.
world?
In the world. So if you speak Mohawk, you're likely to know most Mohawk people who speak the language. Yeah. Yeah. I know, it's quite incredible. Right?
You've got a tall task ahead of you if you want to get that language
Yeah,
more
not just
broadly
me.
spoken.
There's a lot of us doing great work, better than me, and I'm really happy that they're doing that. Yeah, yeah, you got that right.
If we have this, I mentioned at the top, we spoke 10 years ago.
Sure.
If we speak 10 years from now, what are things going to be like?
I'd like to see more children speaking it as a first language, but we need the support from the federal government to garner enough financial resources to put it where really the most effective programs are. And I'd like to see people identifying through use of the language as a primary language within Indigenous communities. And I don't think that's too far-fetched, because we can create highly proficient speakers within 2 to 3 years. So if we have the resources, if we have the support to do that, you'd be amazed how much we can do, considering how much we've done with virtually no resources for the last 50, 60, 70 years, and it's still existing. So you know that the heart is there. People are going to do it without the money. However, we'd like to see enough money that went into destroying our languages to actually revitalizing them in order for things like really to heal the relationships that Indigenous people have with Canada.
That's Ryan DeCare, Associate Professor, Centre for Indigenous Studies in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Toronto. Would you like to say goodbye in Mohawk to us? Thank you, Ryan. Really a pleasure to see you again.
Yeah, thank you.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, October 20th, 2022. Tomorrow, we'll get a COVID-19 update and talk to playwright Ian Shaw about his humorous and moving play about the movie Jaws, which starred, among others, his father, Robert Shaw. Also, we'll have highlights from this week's Toronto mayoral debate, hosted by yours truly at the Toronto Region Board of Trade. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.